Hello friends, welcome to another day of Q&As, joined by my lovely and helpful wife Lucy.
Hi guys.
Lucy will be asking me some of your questions from Instagram.
Alright, the next question is by Ryan Broughton. How big of a role do you believe genetics plays in cognitive performance? Do you believe the mentally elite, such as Elon Musk, were simply born with a superior cognitive ability, or is any average Joe capable of achieving their mental state? Thank you.
Okay, this is a great question. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Ryan. First of all, I'll just summarize for you some of the outcomes from academic research on the subject. We know that, so when I talk about intelligence here, I'm going to be talking about IQ, which is also called G. G is composed of crystallized type intelligence and fluid type intelligence. Crystallized type intelligence is intelligence that you develop over time, like learning how to apply the same techniques that you applied before. Fluid type intelligence is trying to use abstract reasoning for a new kind of problem. Fluid type intelligence decreases as you get past the age of 20, which is one of the reasons that, for example, the prize in mathematics called the Fields Medal, which is like the Nobel Prize in the life sciences. The Fields Medal is the greatest mathematical prize. It's usually given to people below the age of 25. Your fluid intelligence decreases as you age. The crystallized intelligence does it less so. We know that intelligence G is heritable of about 40% in youth, in childhood, and up to 80% in adulthood, heritable from your parents. So if you take the IQ of parents and the IQ of children, about 80% of the adult IQ is correlated to that closely. We also know that academics estimate that about 51 or 50 something percent of the crystallized, of the fluid type intelligence, which is the intelligence that requires more short-term memory, is dependent on linkages between the SNPs. But we don't know really all of the direct, because basically the SNPs there are gene-on-gene actions and SNP on SNP actions, and they're so far difficult for us to understand very well, so mostly we study individual SNPs, but it's estimated that about 50% of them for fluid type and 40% for crystallized type intelligence are between these SNPs.
Okay.
But of course, because think about it like this, when you say G is heritable, what does that mean? That means because it's not just the genes, you're also raised by your parents. So there's two things going on there. So when you break down that 80%, about 50% is estimated to be from the actual genes themselves. So it's quite heritable. We know that some SNPs, now as I said, this stuff is still being studied. We know that some SNPs are, for example, ADAM12, the gene ADAM12, 3 SNPs at ADAM12 are correlated with extremely high intelligence, people above the IQ of 170. The most correlated gene with intelligence overall is FOXO3A, which is also the strongest gene correlated with human longevity. It's a gene involved in the insulin and IGF-1 signaling pathway, and it is responsible for some cell apoptosis, including apoptosis, neuronal apoptosis from oxidative stress. We also know that some genes that are related to myelination. Myelination, for those of you who didn't read my article, I guess last week, you should have read it. But in that article, I mentioned I have a section. It's difficult to read. I understand that. I want people to understand. Look, I'm not publishing articles for the lay audience. I'm not writing BS articles. I'm writing articles that usually the earlier part of the article could be published in an academic journal, and the second part, it's of that level of quality and citations and rigor. And the second part of it is usually about how you could use this for yourself, and that part you couldn't publish in an academic journal, but basically I'm publishing the highest caliber, so I understand if some people have difficulty reading. But anyway, there's a section in it about myelination, and myelination is your axons, which communicate through your brain, they're like little tentacles. They're covered in a cholesterol-rich sheath, which is myelin, produced by myelin, and there are myelinating parts of your body, like oligodendrocytes in the brain. So a lot of these myelin-related genes are correlated to intelligence. And if you guys have done my cognitive analysis package, you'll have seen at least one SNP there that's correlated strongly to intelligence and related to myelination. But also genes that are related to neurogenesis are tied to, like genes related to BDNF, for example, are tied to greater IQs. So that's some background on what we know genetically about IQs. Let me see if I'm forgetting something that may be interesting for you guys. Yeah, that's basically it. So basically, we found some SNPs and some individual parts of the genes. Oh, also, by the way, brain size is tied to intelligence. So there's a very strong correlation between the size of a person's brain and their G. Absolutely.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, and Einstein also, by the way, famously had a huge brain. So
I grew up next to a family that both the parents were engineer. I think they never tested their IQ, but I'm guessing they're higher than normal IQ. They produced 2 children. One of them basically was born with a big head and a big brain. No kidding. Both of them are both of the kids are genius IQ, and one of them he's so his IQ is so high, and he's the one with the bigger brain that he developed some kind of autistic things. But I saw him as a kid, and he had this huge head.
So you mentioned a couple of interesting things there. Number one, historically, electrical engineers have the highest IQ. Right now, it may be people in computer science. I know that at my undergrad, which is the #1 computer science school.
Electrical engineer.
Oh, there we go. Okay, I was going to ask what kind of engineer, but I assumed they weren't electrical. Okay, those are the people that have the highest IQ, especially in their generation. But I think in our generation, probably computer science attracts the most intelligent people. At Carnegie Mellon, the #1 school for computer science in the world, where I went to undergrad, I saw some really shocking, usually Asian students. And we'll talk about race in a little bit, but actually let's talk about it a little bit now. So you talk about head size. So obviously head size has a correlation to brain size also, and I've always noticed that it seems like East Asians have larger heads, especially compared to their body size, especially Koreans. I've always thought that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's true though. Let me tell you, it may not be true. It may be an illusion caused by having very straight hair. They also have thicker, straighter hair, so you can't really tell.
A thinner body. So.
Maybe, yeah, it may be an illusion. But what is not an illusion is that East Asians are the most intelligent people in the world. There have never been studies on. Okay, now this is gonna get a little bit controversial. So guys, I don't mind controversy when I'm talking about honest things, okay? I'm talking about things from research. These are not my opinions. I don't have opinions here, and I am not racist, and I don't, so just, I want to say that ahead of time. But I'm going to tell you guys the truth, because this is an interesting subject. There's a book called The Bell Curve. It's a very famous book. It was written in the 90s. It's about IQ, and it's about IQ in different populations. If you're interested in the subject, you should read The Bell Curve. The Bell Curve got a lot of antagonist reaction from the same kind of people that today would tell you if you say a transsexual is technically not a woman, they would fire you from university. Those kind of people that they want their opinion to be fact. And I have nothing against transsexuals. If I made a transsexual, I'd call her a woman. I don't have a problem with it. But if you tell me she can give birth to a child, this is not true physically. But you'll get fired from university for talking about that today. In the same way, the bell curve was attacked. Because the bell curve pointed out something. And I've looked into this. I'm very interested in this subject. So I've looked into this because of genetics. I'm very interested in... See, my interest in genetics is not just about genes, it's also about ancestry. In fact, I was originally more specialized in ancestry. I used to research for family tree DNA in particular ancestry groups, and she knows my experience in that also is very, very intense. I'm very interested in human populations. I've moved around the world and stuff like that. So I got into this concept a long time ago, but basically what you find is that certain ethnicities and certain nations have far higher IQs than other nations. I mean, shockingly higher. So I don't recall the exact details, but I'll give you some examples. So Singapore has the highest IQ. Singapore and Hong Kong has the highest IQ. The East Asians Singapore has a lot of Chinese. That's probably why. But so Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Taiwanese, the Chinese in Singapore have extremely high IQs. Much higher than anywhere else in the world, almost double the IQs that exist in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there is one thing you have to keep in mind. IQ or G changes according to education.
I was going to say,
no, it's not. It changes when you educate yourself. So we've talked about this before. Someone left a comment on my channel saying IQ doesn't change. You can't change IQ. I don't know. No, you can change your IQ. Especially if you're younger, if you go and push yourself to the limit mentally, your brain will change and you will become better at abstract reasoning, which is pure intelligence. You will become better at it. I did. I know I did, personally. It's real. I've seen it myself, and it's shown in the research that people. One of the biggest correlates with IQ is level of educational accomplishment. You have a master's degree, PhD.
Let me ask you, with people having the same level of education, depending of where their race or like the race are,
that's another thing
is
we
it
talk
the
about.
same?
So this is where it gets very interesting. So basically, the problem with the bell curve that people didn't like was that it showed, and there's a lot of, I'm not going to cite all of them here because I don't want to go through it all again. So often when I read things, I keep the papers, but this stuff I read like years ago, so I didn't keep all the papers. Maybe I'll go through a little bit of them. But the point is, what's been shown is that, so let me talk about the world first, then I'll talk about where you grew up. But in terms of the world, the lowest IQs are in sub-Saharan Africa. But again, they have the lowest level of educational achievement for the whole society. So that may not be just genetic, right? So we can ignore that. Also have very low IQs in the Middle East, also, actually, surprisingly. Very low IQs. Greece actually has a very high IQ, if I remember, but not compared to, in general in Europe, the northwestern Europeans have the highest IQs. Germans have very high IQ. Those kind of Germanic peoples have high IQs, usually. And interestingly, Italians have high IQs also, which was surprising. I didn't expect because they're in the Mediterranean area, but they have high IQs also. And so that's in terms of Europe, but the Asians have the highest. And I think now we went around the world a little bit. I'm not going into the... By the way, you guys can go online and you can find IQs by nation. You can find a ranking and you can go through the ranking. You'll find it very interesting. Now, and keep in mind that the level of education someone goes through impacts how high their IQ is. And you'll find... So what you would really want to do if you want to do a statistical analysis is do an analysis based on the average level of education in a country and modifying the IQ by that. So you can have, you know what I mean? So if you put them all on the same level.
Exactly.
But then again, the academic institutions are better in the West than they are abroad in other places. So even if someone has a master's degree from Angola, his master's degree probably didn't teach him everything that a master's degree from England or France or the US. So it's hard to really differentiate and say it's a genetic thing. But where it becomes easier is when you go into one country. So the United States, which is what the bell curve was focused on. So in the United States, on average, so by the way, to give you an example, like, so average IQ is supposed to be 100. That's where it's based on. 100 is supposed to be average. So some places in Africa, you find an IQ of 65 or something like that. And some places in the Middle East, for example, you have like 80s or something like that. Germans, 115. Well, that was probably German engineers. No, Germans are not 115, sorry. Germans are like 101 or something like that, or 100. Americans are not 100. Although the IQ was originally made for the average American intelligence, the average American intelligence has decreased so much that 100 is no longer average, even though it's based on the US. The only people who are averaged above 100 is, I think, probably one European nation and then the East Asians. They're like 102, 103, something like that. They're average. So that's some background there. But in the US, it's very interesting. And this is controversial, and I hope you guys understand. This is not my opinion. These are just things that are outcomes of research. So it's very interesting to think about. Now we know, let me tell you, we know that genes affect how IQ develops. We know that for sure, right? We estimate that 40 to 50% of the IQ is directly from gene-on-gene interactions, stuff like that. And we know, and I know in particular, because I analyze people's DNA. I've analyzed East Asians, I've analyzed Africans, I've analyzed Caucasians, I've analyzed Middle Eastern people, and I tell you something. When I analyze an East Asian, I sometimes I don't even bother to go through certain SNPs because I know that they don't have them. They don't have certain alleles at certain SNPs that are concerning. It's such a different outcome. Like if you look at my genetic analysis for Caucasians, different people, like quite a bit of it is similar. But when you compare mine with a Hispanic person, it's completely different. Even just even in my cognitive analysis, it's really different alleles. And the same for an African. So, and you see this throughout the world of medicine also. I mean, look at when you go get your EGFR for your kidney. When you're African American, they say or even if you're not, they say EGFR. If African American, EGFR, if not African American. Because it's very different kidney function. So they have impacts on how your body functions. Your genes have impacts. And what does it mean? It's not the color of your skin. It's the fact that you've been breeding in a certain group for a long time. So you have genes in common. And those genes are not about your melanin, and they're not about your face, and they're not about your hair. They are about those, but they're about other things also. Those genes, just like your skin is different, your body inside is different too. Your kidney is different, your brain is different. A lot of things are different. A lot of small things are different. Now, what's the difference from? It's from mating together. So 70,000 years ago, most humans left Africa. Well, not most humans. Most humans outside of Africa left Africa between 70 to 60,000 years ago. When we left Africa, people got situated in certain areas, and we couldn't travel easily. So we would mate with people around us, which developed what are visual phenotypes of people, like blonde people existed here. Europe used to be mostly redheaded. East Asians originally lived in the Middle East. Then they moved from the Middle East to East Asia. Some of the people from Africa, because everyone who left Africa settled in the Middle East originally, in the Arabian Peninsula. And then from there, they moved to East Asia, they moved to the West, some moved back to Africa, and so on. But we stayed in certain areas and we mated with people around us. So we developed clustering of genes, which is why people tell you shouldn't marry your cousin. Why? Because then you only have a small pool of genes. So if you have some not bad genes, but some genes that can cause you problems. So generally, I mentioned this in the introduction to my genetic analysis. If you're my client, you've already read this, but basically, the more you have common alleles at a certain gene, the more intense that gene affects you. So if I have an oxytocin receptor gene like the one I have, which one of the alleles is tied to less empathy. If I had two alleles tied to less empathy, on most SNPs, not all of them, some SNPs, one is enough to give you the effect. But most of them, if you have two, it becomes worse. So what happens in a small society is you get more of these twos going on in certain areas, which doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just means you get a certain kind of trait.
Yeah, it's more intense.
It intensifies a certain trait, and then over time you get what's called, you get this kind of like grouping, a genotype, a kind of, that's what they call it, a genotype, a kind of group things that come together. So for example, African Americans will have, or Africans will have worse kidney function on average. East Asians will have Hispanics will have worse liver function. Hispanics have much higher rates of fatty liver disease than anyone else in the world, and particularly due to one SNP, which I check for all my clients. And if you're a Caucasian, you don't have it, because I've never had a Caucasian so far that has had that SNP. So far, and there are Caucasians who have it, but it's very, very rare. So there are certain things that go with. So this is the background behind that. Now, what you find is in America, African Americans, on average, their IQ is around 80, if I recall correctly, the average IQ. The average American IQ is somewhere around, now as I told you guys, I haven't read this for years, but it's somewhere around 98, the average, or 97. It used to be 100, but the population changed. There's been more immigration from abroad, and a lot of the immigration has not been from Europe. So, although there has been immigration from East Asia, which you would think would raise the IQ, but a lot of the original American immigrants were white people. The original Americans are American Indians, but the original, or Native Americans. But the original immigrants were, a lot of them first were from England, and well, there was French and all that stuff, but for a long time, between 1700 to 1850 or so, was British, and a lot of British and a lot of English and a lot of Scottish. And that was sort of the WASPs of America, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which is what my mother's family's, all kind of those kind of people. The American genetic fiber changed, especially in the last 100 years. Or 120 years, 130 years. At the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, there was a lot of immigration from Ireland and from Italy, and that lasted, and from Jewish people, who, by the way, Jewish people have, I should talk about Jewish IQ at the end. Jews are very interesting. Ashkenazi Jews have extremely high IQs, similar to East Asians, but Israel doesn't have a very high IQ because there are also Sephardic Jews there. The Sephardic Jews are Spanish Jews or Middle Eastern Jews, Yemeni Jews, Yemenite Jews, and Spanish Jews. Those guys don't actually have above average IQs, but Ashkenazi Jews have really, really high IQs. So actually, most of the immigration to the U.S. by Jews was from Ashkenazi Jews, but nonetheless, the point is first there was Italians, Irish, and then Jews in the early 20th century, and then there came much more Hispanic immigration, and then immigration from other parts of the world. This changed the fiber of the U.S. So the IQ of the U.S. went from 100 to a little bit below. I don't know if it's 98 now, 97, something like that. The average IQ with African Americans is around 80. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this is the controversial part of that book, and it's very unfortunate.
When this data was taken?
When
this data
research. What I'm talking about is from academic journals, not from the book. The book was in the mid 1990s. The academic articles I read were about 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay.
It's current, but what's basically shown is this: African Americans have the lowest IQ of any ethnicity in the U.S. And their IQ doesn't, and I say this with caution, but on average, the African American IQ does not reach the Caucasian IQ or the Asian IQ, even if they're in the same population. So if they go to the same school or they live outside of an African American neighborhood, like one African American family living in a Caucasian neighborhood. Now, there could be many reasons for this. He's the African American young boy. He's raised still by his parents and his grandparents, and there's intergenerational learning that he's maybe missing or something. There could be many reasons, but the point is, it does not show that on average they do not. If they move him out of the community, they do, and with the educational achievement still on average they are below the Caucasians, and the Caucasians are on average always below the Asians, the East Asians, not as far below as the African Americans, and the Hispanics, by the way, are in between the African Americans and the Caucasians. So it's, if I remember the averages correctly, and don't quote me on this, something like 80, 90, and then 97 or 100. If you look at the Caucasian population, the average is close to 100, but the U.S. population is a little bit lower because of that.
So since we know that about 40 to 50% of the IQ comes from genetics, what do you think affects the other 50%? Is it food, lifestyle, environment?
Oh, that's a good point. So that's a good point that you bring up, which is food. Many people don't realize that the nutrition that someone experiences in their childhood permanently affects the way their brain functions. So that's another thing you could think of. Maybe people in these low-income communities are not getting the right nutrition, or they're getting viruses or infections that could affect their brain for the rest of their life, and this has been shown to be true. I'm not going to go find citations for you guys, but if you'd like, there's a very interesting discussion on the Joe Rogan podcast. Joe Rogan interviewed an immunologist. Now it's going to be hard to find him because of the coronavirus, but before there was only one immunologist he had interviewed. He interviewed him twice, once during the coronavirus, but once a couple of years ago. Watch that video if you're interested. You'll see that in low-income communities, there is a lot of infections that affect brain function. And this happens for life. I mean, also in the South. In the South, you have a lot of different kinds of infections and parasitic things and things like that affect your brain function. And we know, for example, from cats, you can get a virus that can make you more risk-seeking, to change the way you think. So it could be viruses, parasites, bacteria affecting the way the brain functions, vitamins and minerals in childhood, protein. So protein, very important if you want your IGF-1 and consequently your neurogenesis in your brain to be high. You have to eat a lot of protein when you're young. Who can't afford a lot of protein when they're young? Poor people. Poor people eat rice and stuff like that. But then again, you go to East Asian communities, they don't eat much protein. And they have much higher IQ than everybody else.
But they eat a lot of more raw food, more vegetables.
Well, traditionally they eat a lot of rice. If you think about Japanese and Chinese, they eat a lot of rice, and rice, But
they have also less processed meat. I feel like low-income community in the U.S. are not getting regular protein, but more like processed meat because it's much cheaper.
What we would say is they can't afford it. Low-income community,
they can't afford it, so they try to find
certainly that's gonna have effects on. Oh, that's actually you could bring up a great point. So that has an effect where, if you're eating non-organic foods and stuff like that, you're putting your body in an inflammatory state when you're younger.
Yeah.
And we talked about this in the organic food video. You guys should watch that video if you're interested. Children who eat non-organic food have more ADHD. They have, all these kind of things are tied there. In fact, not only that, when a mother is pregnant, if she's eating non-organic food, her child will have more likelihood to have tremors in their hand, which is neurological problems, as well as ADHD, as well as other things. So this goes on, And there's also an epigenetic effect. It happens between generations. So your father, when he was young, he didn't eat enough, and that changed his genes, which he passed along to you. Epigenetic is how genes are passed down in short term. They're not mutations. They're methylation of genes. So. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of things that's why we're saying 40 to 50%, because a lot of it is how the parents taught you, what the opportunities they gave you, and that's why one of the reasons the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor on average is because things are taught intergenerationally that they don't teach you in college. They don't. Parents that with good families. That's why a lot of the time you find, actually, there's a very good book on this subject. It's called. I gotta find the name. I'll put it on here for you guys. I highly recommend this book. It's about inheritance. It's about the heritability of certain things. And they talk about, families, how, for example, and I know this very well. There's certain families. So, for example, if you were an orphan, you were more likely to abandon your children sometimes. If you have drug addiction in your family, drug addiction can pass through a family so many times, through so many generations, that by the end you're saying it doesn't make sense that it's just genetic because it's been 6 generations, Yeah. Every time a couple mates, they mix all the alleles at every SMP. And so for example, a person shares about 10 to 15% of their genetic data with their first cousin. It's not that much. Yeah. You share about 30% with your uncle. There are some brothers that share only 30% of their genetic data. Not 50. It's not always 50. Sometimes it's 30. It's lower. So as you go down a generation, the genetic data changes. But some drug addiction can stay 5-6 generations. So you show that there's a kind of learning that's going on. And so there are many reasons why you would think that certain... and I don't like the term race because race is a stupid term. Right? But we're talking about groups of genes that come together in communities. There's reasons that some of these communities will have lower IQs than other communities. There could be education, there could be nutrition when they're young, there could be all these kind of things. But I have to say that my personal belief from all of my 10 plus years of looking at genes and my personal experience of observation and stuff like that is that there are some genes that are more represented in Ashkenazi Jewish people and in Caucasians, particularly Italians and Greeks, as well as I believe Greeks, I could be wrong, but definitely Italians, as well as Germanic Europeans that make, and East Asians, those people, that group, East Asians, Germanic Europeans, some Mediterranean Europeans, and Ashkenazi Jews. These people, I believe, have genetic polymorphisms that make them naturally more intelligent. Now, he asked another question, which is, he said, Elon Musk. I don't know much about Elon Musk. She's the fan of Elon Musk. She loves Elon Musk and Tesla. I only started liking Elon Musk recently because he's been making what I consider self-sacrificial, honorable political statements.
So what I think about Elon Musk is I don't think he's extremely smart, don't make me wrong, but I don't think he's smarter than some other people. What I think he's very risk-taking. He doesn't... he would do things to... he has a long-term... definitely a very long-term vision of things, and he doesn't care about upsetting certain people or he will do anything to achieve his goal. And his end goal, he wants to put people to Mars, and he will do anything for it. It's he's very smart in the way he approaches it, but I think he's more he doesn't have this... he's more risk adverse.
Risk-seeking.
Risk-seeking, yeah.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was going to say about Elon Musk. I don't know enough about him to... as I said, I like what he's been doing recently. Why I like it is because it's not about political views. It's about... I can tell that this guy is going to go through so much hatred from California and liberals and stuff like that. But he's saying what he believes in, and he wants to open up his shop, he wants to work, he wants to be there. That thing was just so inspirational. I started liking him. But I haven't watched enough of his interviews to see how he thinks, to know how intelligent he is. You can usually tell how intelligent someone is by how quickly their abstract reasoning is, which you can see in conversation sometimes. By the way, guys, Lucie she's very intelligent. She has extremely good abstract reasoning, more than me, I'm sure. I haven't taken an IQ test, and I don't think she has either. But
When I was young.
When you were young, I've taken actually, I had the highest scores at my former company for aptitude tests, but in their history. But it wasn't an IQ test, so I don't know the number. But I'm completely certain that Lucy has a higher IQ than me, higher G than me. But what I was gonna say is, you can usually tell if someone does. I don't know if Elon does, but what I would say is this: I'm sure of one thing: the most successful people in the world and the most impactful people are not the people that have the highest IQ. Those people need to have a minimum level of IQ to become that level. You have to you can't have a 90 IQ and be that successful. It's very, very hard to. I mean, you could be successful. And for example, in bodybuilding, there are some people, I'm certain, that are 80 IQ or 90 IQ that are, I'm not even talking about pros, I'm talking about the very big influencers on YouTube and stuff like that I know he has 80 IQ or 70 or maybe something like that. But so you can in some ways in the modern world, but talking about in terms of business or in terms of politics or stuff like that, it's almost impossible if you have lower IQ than 100. But 100 to 120 to 130, that's the range I think that most of the great people in the world in history have been. I think Napoleon was probably not above 140. Those 170 people sometimes actually are not very successful. But what you do find is that these people have a way of thinking that leads them. And I don't believe that achievements in the outside world are the best way to live. I'm not driven by that. If I was, I wouldn't be making YouTube videos. I would be doing probably what I was doing before in my career. But for people who are interested in that, who are interested in what's called greatness, leaving a mark after you die and stuff like that, I've studied history since I was a child. I know more about history than I do about any other subject. And I studied personalities, I studied individuals, I studied the way they think, I studied, in detail. And the people that do that tend to have a couple of things in common. They tend to be organized people, driven. They tend to have had something that affected their ego in younger life. They want to prove something. If you don't want to prove something, you don't become a billionaire. Because after 100 million, you realize, okay, it's not worth it anymore. I'm going to go have fun. But I know people personally who are worth $5 billion. Actually, I know people like that, and the guy doesn't enjoy anything. I mean, the guy I'm thinking about is worth $5 billion specifically. You go to his house, he has a BMW, Mercedes, stuff like that. Each one of them is the lowest model possible that you can buy. The cheapest one of the class. So he has a C-Class, he has a 7 Series, but with all the low options. He's on Forbes. He's worth $5 billion on Forbes, and he's been worth that way for a long time. His clothes are not good. He owns a clothing company. He owns several clothing companies. So when you're like that, it's a determination. Look at Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett, they always make fun of his suits, and he says, no, my suits are expensive, but they just look bad on me. But Warren Buffett doesn't do anything. He goes to eats McDonald's. He sits at home. He doesn't do much. He has this close friend he had his whole life. But he accumulated so much money, and he has so much power.
How about our friend Jeff Bezos?
Jeff Bezos, that guy from Amazon. He's I don't know. I don't like Jeff Bezos at all. I really dislike his character. But what I'm trying to say is this: I don't know. He's a little bit different. But what I want to say is this: people who are driven, sometimes they have a midlife. Sometimes they succeed and they start to enjoy or stuff like that. But generally, to get to that and also he says he's a little bit different. He was sort of lucky a little bit. He got those tech guys are a lot of luck. So when you have a lot of I'm not saying he's not smart, I'm saying that he was in the right place at the right time. When people accumulate money like Warren Buffett, that's not luck. That is consistent aptitude over time. He's relentless. He doesn't even invest in technology. He didn't make many lucky breaks. He's just very capable, and he keeps accumulating money, and he never stops. Why? Because of ego. Maybe Warren Buffett is different. Actually, Warren Buffett's a bad example because Warren Buffett is known to actually enjoy accounting. So he's very different. He's actually having fun a little bit in his own way. But like, for example, the billionaire that I know who will remain nameless. I know several billionaires, but that individual billionaire, he wants to prove something. Something happened in his childhood. It's like, you can think about great people in the world. Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill didn't know his parents. His father was syphilitic and rarely met him. His mother and him had an extremely formal relationship. He would write her letters when he was younger. Could you please visit me at boarding school? And his mother would be busy. No, I can't visit you. And he had a nanny. He always respected his mother and father, but they were distant from him. So he grew up with something to prove. And he proved it really to the world. Winston Churchill changed the whole world. Or you look at some less savory characters in history. Some of them, like Stalin, grew up very poor. He was a criminal when he was younger. He had to be a criminal. He had nothing going for him in Georgia. Or you look at Hitler. Hitler was raised, father, very old father, distant from him. His father was not thought to be the son of his grandfather. He grew up in a bad situation, not many friends, odd environment, something to prove to people. I'm talking about political figures, but Napoleon also this desire to prove, ego. But when you talk about business people, I mean, the business people are a little bit different sometimes, but generally it comes from a desire to have wealth that comes from power, a desire to have power over people, to be driven by ego, that either you want to protect yourself, so that whatever happened to me will never happen again, I'll show them, or you want to make yourself, give yourself magnitude, give yourself importance in history. They will know me. They will know my name. When my name is sung, the mountains will shake. That kind of view. That's what leads people to accomplish a great deal, So what I'm trying to say is, it's not just about your intelligence. And then there's other things than that. It's about introspection. It's about understanding people, having empathy with people, understanding how to lead people. I mean, one of those powerful traits is charisma.
Yeah.
Charisma does not come from the 170 IQ people. You see some people that are so charismatic. I mean, who have I been talking about recently? That cook. What's that cook's name? The British cook. He's very charismatic. Gordon Ramsay. Yeah. Gordon Ramsay's very charismatic. I mean, there are a lot of people that are charismatic, but the point is, even Gordon Ramsay's very charismatic. And look at that guy, accumulated so much wealth, and he's probably you would guess he's above 120 IQ also. But another thing I should mention when we mention Gordon Ramsay has a drug addict sibling. And a lot of times intelligence is tied with mental issues also. So the SNPs that are tied to intelligence are also tied to schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And interestingly, intelligence is also tied to the how long you live. So maybe through the FOXO3A gene, which is the one that's most tied to it, but intelligent people tend to live longer also. But anyway, we're going all over the place, and this is not so organized, but this is just our thoughts. I mean, you agree that you need a basal level of intelligence to achieve much, but getting past that point, I
think it's about decision making. It's about politics also. It's about your environment, the economical situation. It's about many pieces of the puzzle. It's just not one. I don't think intelligence will make somebody successful necessarily.
And I should mention, intelligence genetically is a very polygenic trait. It goes in a Gaussian curve. Gauss was a German mathematician, what they also call a normal curve or a bell curve. And when you have a bell curve, like you do with height, it's very polygenic. Height is not determined just by your IGF-1 receptor or your growth hormone receptors. By around 200 SNPs are correlated to height. So it's the same with intelligence. There's a lot of things there. The way I look at it is that whatever you're born with, you can make the best of it.
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't born very intelligent. I really worked very hard. And I wasn't obsessed with being intelligent, but I was obsessed with, that's how I got into pharmacology and into PEDs and all these kind of things, is trying to make the best of what I have. Okay, I wasn't gifted with a family situation. I wasn't gifted with a quick brain. I wasn't gifted with whatever. I wasn't whatever. But I make the best of what I can. I'm gonna go read the books, read about the historical figures, try to understand what did they understand that I don't understand. And then slowly build up that way. And doing that, thinking like that, trains your brain to become productive and to.
That's true.
That's what I have to say on the subject. Thank you for the question. It was a very interesting question. I hope we didn't bore you. Have a great day.